Welcome into Northside Territory, Foul Territory Network's Cubs podcast. I'm Sahadev Sharma with my partner Patrick Mooney. Today, Patrick, we are going to talk with Geoff Pontes of Baseball America. The Baseball America just released the Cubs top 10 prospect list. Geoff did a long chat with Cubs fans or prospect hounds, who knows, a combination of the two. Uh,
A couple
Geoff,
sickos.
yeah, sickos desperate for prospect news. Geoff, thanks so much for joining us. It's not, uh, uh, prospect. It's not a system flush with talent. A lot of near graduates, but I guess let's just start. Um, the overall thoughts on this system and where they sit.
Yeah, I have to say I'm pretty thankful to the Cubs for not graduating Moises Ballesteros, Owen Casey, and Kevin Alcantara, just because it did leave me some interesting players to write about. Had those guys graduated, I think this system would probably rank a lot lower, and would be far less enjoyable writing and reading. But I think it's still the strength that they had last year, where there are some close to the majors players here, guys who have already debuted now, kind of across the board within that group. And then you have somebody like Jackson Wiggins, who I think upside wise is probably one of the more interesting pitching prospects in any system. Had there been, maybe a few more innings, he had that shutdown in July where they kind of kept it quiet, and it was more or less reported as just trying to limit his innings. Obviously, somebody that had, surgery coming out of the draft, limited track record of success at Arkansas, but the stuff has always been big. This was sort of his breakout year. This is the best year that he's had, since he walked on campus at Arkansas, and then obviously was drafted and became a professional. There's big stuff there. He's probably the guy in the system I'm most excited about. But was a little bit more cautious in terms of ranking him, simply because of what the injury risk is there. This is a guy where we haven't seen him ever exceed, 100 plus innings in a year. And that's a bit of a limiting factor when it comes to projecting as a starting pitching prospect. We've learned over time that innings really do matter quite a bit, even more so than stuff.
Geoff, one thing that jumped out to me on this list is that Wiggins is the only pitcher on that top 10. And Sahadev was asking about that at the GM meetings. Like, what are the Cubs hitting prospects that good, or are their pitching prospects that bad? How would you look at what seems to be a real imbalance in the system?
Yeah, I think you look at this system and there's just not a lot of upside arms, right? You have some guys who I think are what I would qualify as starter depth, number 6, number 7 starters. Good teams definitely need guys like that to supplement innings throughout the year. I think obviously the Dodgers have an extreme embarrassment of riches in terms of the pitching prospects in their organization and just pitchers in general. But you do need sort of that depth. The problem is all the guys that they have that are sort of that depth are kind of at the lowest rung of the type of pitching prospect you would even let start a major league game. You're talking about guys like Brandon Birdsell, who obviously is now dealing with injury and, could potentially miss all of next year. Will Sanders, who was good at points in time at South Carolina, was considered a decent draft prospect as an underclassman. That sort of fell apart during his junior campaign. He's been fine as a professional, but he's once again not the kind of guy that is going to be a number 3 starter or better, or someone that even projects as like a dominant reliever. And it's a lot of arms like that. Even like a breakout arm like Justin Florentino. It's a soft tosser. It's a really interesting sweeper, but it's mid 70s. I mean, he's a smaller guy. You kind of go throughout this system. The only guy with true upside, it feels like, outside of the top 10 pitching wise is Caleb Wing, and we haven't seen it yet. So a lot of that is going off of amateur reports. He wouldn't be the first pitching prospect that backed up from what his amateur numbers are. He wouldn't be the first pitching prospect as an amateur that saw his stuff get better as a professional. But I don't think that we have a lot of faith at this point that the Cubs player development, particularly on the pitching side, is capable of making those guys better. We've had a big win recently with Kade Horton. one that I think you could probably look back in the last 30 years of the Cubs farm system, and they haven't had a whole lot of those wins. Even when they were really successful under Theo Epstein, they didn't develop pitching. So I do think that's a concern. And I think it's a concern when you look at where this team falls sort of in the potential contenders amongst the National League. All of those teams that are going to be competing with the Dodgers, et cetera, the Mets, whoever, have a lot more pitching. And you sort of have to wonder, where is it going to come from? Because they're going to have, if they're going to build a contending starting rotation, it's not going to be from internal resources. They're going to have to make some trades from those young position players that have just debuted that we talked about at the top of the system, or they're going to have to go out and spend $500 million to, invest in that rotation. It's just, there's a lack of options there that I think are good enough to make a deep playoff run.
We've heard this story before, Patrick.
I'm getting flashbacks.
Yeah. Okay, so you touched on it there, and like, to be honest, I think Patrick and I have heard a lot of different stories about this recently. It's been something that I've been looking into because I'm curious about it. I'm curious what you've heard. Do you believe it's a mix of things, this issue, or you touched on it, player development maybe? Is it player development? Is it amateur draft? I get a lot of reports on, like, what are these pitchers that they're drafting? People aren't thrilled with it around the league. I'm saying they don't quite understand their tactics when it comes to drafting pitchers. Is that, like, what's your focus when you look back on the, let's say, the last 4 or 5 drafts and then player development stuff? Is that where would you place more blame?
Yeah, so I sort of subscribe to the philosophy that it's twofold, right? There's an old line. I'm from New England. I'm a Patriots fan, and I'm old, so I'm sorry, everybody. But there's an old line from Bill Parcells when he was walking out the door and had his issue with Kraft, and it was, if you're going to ask me to cook the meal, you should at least let me shop for the groceries. Now, we don't have an all-encompassing dictator that's making baseball decisions and managing the team. It doesn't happen in baseball, but I do think it's the same sort of concept with player development, being involved in the targeting and identification on the amateur side, and making sure that you're targeting guys with good traits that we can accentuate and turn into better pitchers. Whether it's the Rays, whether it's the Dodgers, whether it's, and these are people that came from the Cubs front office, whether it's the Red Sox. If you look at the Red Sox, this is another team that historically has not developed pitching prospects. John Lester and Clay Buchholz kind of stand alone as the only guys in my lifetime. And I was going to Pawtucket Red Sox games in 1989. So, like, I've seen a lot of Red Sox prospects. They've never been able to develop pitching. They brought in different people. They started to involve those people in the amateur evaluation process and identifying traits. And then we have Peyton Tolley, and we have Conley Early, and we have some of these guys that are then able to learn new pitches, add velocity, get better. They're ceiling. And I think the issue with a lot of the pitchers that the Cubs have taken is relying on the model. They've drafted a lot of hitters that have certain traits. They all have pretty good in-zone whiff. They all have good swing decisions. They all have good EVs. And I think Ethan Conrad and Cam Smith are certainly wins in that direction. But then you start to look at some of the later rounds, even some of the high school guys that they're taking. I actually had somebody with the amateur team with the Cubs years ago, maybe 2 years ago after the Cam Smith draft, kind of joke that we took a bunch of first basemen and corner infielders and corner outfielders. And I think that's the issue with model drafting, is you miss on upside because you're not evaluating some of the other traits and characteristics that can turn guys into stars, that can make guys better. No player, and I actually heard this from somebody once again in the Cubs front office, they tell me that they don't believe that any players that come into the system are fully developed yet, that everybody has room to develop. Well, if that's the case, then why haven't we seen guys honestly take big steps forward in their development, under the Cubs tutelage? That's even on the hitting side a little bit. We heard all the stuff about Justin Stone. We haven't seen a big breakout bat. Even Matt Shaw this year was kind of underwhelming at the plate, frankly. And so I think you look at all those characteristics, and I think that it is, frankly, an amateur targeting problem to an extent. I think they do a pretty good job in the early rounds, The models are supposed to eat in round 5 to 20, and they're just not doing that. And I think some of it is, what they're targeting. I just don't see the high upside pitchers coming in. And, even a bad system like the Astros that I cover the Astros, I cover the Cardinals, I cover the Blue Jays, and I cover the Cubs. Every single one of those systems is a lot more pitching than the Cubs do. And they don't necessarily have more resources. And some of them have been very limited in terms of what they can do in the draft. I mean, even the Cardinals have kind of turned it around. That was a team that for years was kind of drafting really boring model pitchers, left-handers who threw soft, that had good walk rates and decent strikeout rates. It was sort of that K to BB model. This year they go out and they draft Liam Doyle. They get Tanner Franklin. They get Cade Crossland. They actually have some interesting arms now. And I don't know if that's the Chaim Bloom effect, because he certainly had some of that impact in Boston, maybe a little bit less drastic, but that's the kind of stuff that I think the Cubs need to start doing. They need to start targeting more upside and figuring out how internally they can then turn those upside traits into actual skills and production. And for a team like this that's been lacking in pitching, I think it's something that's really, really hurt them.
I mean, I've heard similar stuff, and I agree. I think you want upside with pitching, like you want to lean on your development, because I do think there are some people that can out them. Brezzo built something solid there. It maybe needs to be fine tuned. You always want to fine tune, but there are ways to get better, and I think going upside is makes a lot of sense. Let's take a quick break and get back to chatting with Geoff Pontes about Cubs prospects.
AJ, we're going to do things a little bit differently here. I am wearing the Perfect Jean, and I remember seeing ads for the Perfect Jean, like most comfortable fit ever, perfect fit on your body. And I was like, I'm not buying it. Now I'm buying it, and we're showing it off on FT.
Please get off my desk, first of all, Scott. Second of all, I was with you. I was skeptical about Perfect Jean, and then I got a pair, and the fitting was perfect. And my body's not hard to fit because I got a big old rear and big old legs from years of squatting, and they fit perfectly. They're stretchy, they're comfortable, they're fashionable. They're everything I look for in a jean, and now I have an extra pair, and I'm going to wear them all the time.
FOUL15 is the code at theperfectjean.nyc. FT listeners get 15% off your first order, plus free shipping, free returns, and free exchanges when you use code FOUL15 at checkout. That's 15% off for new customers at theperfectjean.nyc with promo code FOUL15. After your purchase, they'll ask you where you heard about them. Please support the show and tell them Foul Territory sent you.
All right. Welcome back to Northside Territory with Baseball America's Geoff Pontes talking Cubs prospects. Patrick, go ahead and ask whatever you got for Geoff.
No, I appreciate your informed, balanced perspective, because I don't know, being around the Cubs and covering the Cubs, as you know, Geoff, there's usually a lot of hype around their guys. And when you framed it as like looking back at the last 30 years, like, you're right in terms of the pitching side. I mean, kind of Big Z, Kerry Wood, Mark Pryor, Jeff Samardzija, Justin Steele. Maybe you can get a little credit for Kyle Hendricks, even though he wasn't fully homegrown. So what's kind of your outlook? Because we were just at the GM meetings hearing all this stuff of looking at the Cubs. They really have essentially Dansby Swanson on a fully guaranteed deal after 2026. We don't know what's going to happen with the next CBA. What is your kind of outlook on this organization? Like, can these young hitters carry them? Is there enough to backfill? Looking more broader, not just filling out a pitching staff. Like, what's kind of your 5-year outlook, considering how well you know it from kind of the bottom up?
Yeah, I think the question is like, how much do the Cubs want to stink for a couple of years? I think that you have players like Owen Casey, Alcantara, Ballesteros, maybe Conrad, depending upon how the health bounces back, and Kane Kepley as guys that can probably move pretty fast out of the most recent draft. And we're seeing college players with skills that, produce early. We're seeing those guys move really fast at this point in time. So that's sort of a trend. I still think they can hit. I think the lineup is going to produce runs. Even without Kyle Tucker, there's still enough offense here. And I think especially in comparison to some of the other teams in their division, I understand how many runs the Brewers scored last year. It wouldn't shock me if the Cubs offense is better than the Brewers, if they slide back a little bit, deal with some injuries. Some of the guys that had big years for them don't. We can't bet on that, but I do think that the lineup wise is fine. It really is the pitching that concerns me the most. I think they can score enough runs. You know, production from Seiya Suzuki and just progression from him as a hitter. Michael Busch, regardless of how Zaire Hope looks in that Dodger system, and that shines off the rose a little bit there too. Busch has been a really good player. Nico Horner still a really good player. Ian Happ can hit. I think Ballesteros probably is going to be your DH. Maybe he catches 20 to 30 games. I'm still a little questionable about whether they trust him enough back there. Kelly had a pretty good year. We know what PCA does when he's locked in. I'm not writing off a guy that had a 30-30 year because he had a couple of tough months. I think his style of hitting is just going to be like that. He's going to be a guy that's a little bit streaky. So I think you look through the whole lineup and it's like, all right, this is a pretty good lineup. This is a playoff lineup. I think the big question for me, though, is, are they going to move out some of these guys that might be secondary pieces, which Alcantara and Casey at this point kind of look that way? Can they package some of those pieces together and upgrade the pitching staff? Can they go into free agency and upgrade the pitching staff? I really think that's the big question mark. It's not a bad team. I don't think it's a poorly run organization, but I do think that the holes in their swing, the stuff that they're missing on right now, drags them down a little bit because it's so important. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be a bunch of elite pitchers like we saw with the Blue Jays. I think you just need to have some sturdy vets, guys that can get deep into games and compete. And I'm just not sure that they have that outside of Kade Horton. And I guess, we'll see with what Matthew Boyd and Jamison Tyon are this year. But overall, I think, they need another one or two, even more so than bringing back Kyle Tucker. I honestly think trying to build the top of that rotation is going to make all the difference in the world.
Kind of on that topic, and you touched on two of the names, but I'm curious overall, 2025 draft, what were your thoughts? Any intrigue beyond, like Conrad? It feels like an incomplete right now. We just don't know. I hear like a lot of positives. Like this guy could be really good. It could be I don't want to say Cam Smith type steal, but a steal, a later, a later pick in the first round that turns out to be pretty solid. Kepley obviously had good numbers. Outside of that, I don't know who to be excited about. If there's anyone for Cubs fans to be excited about.
Yeah. I'm really excited about those top two guys in the system. Had Conrad played a little bit longer at Wake, or, had come back and played, late in the season, did get some video of him in sort of backfield workouts in October and early November. And the swing looks good again. He's looking healthy again. I know I've heard he probably might play some first base early before he goes back into center field. Some of that might just be with the throwing, etc. I will say, like, I saw this guy's breakout on the Cape a couple summers ago. At that time was at Marist, mid-major type school, led the nation in triples. He's a big, tall, strong, plus athlete, left-handed bat. There's probably a better foundational plate skills than there were with Cam Smith. Not as much power, but some power, and a more realistic shot to be a plus defender. Even if it's, plus in right field and more of above average to average in center, that's still a really useful player. Kane Kepley is he's sort of a Brewers player, like a guy who makes a ton of contact, really good swing decisions. He is a terror on the bases. Just a sleep paralysis demon for catchers. Like he's got great jumps. He makes great reads. He's super aggressive. I've gotten plus grades in center field. Maybe doesn't play there because of PCA, but a really good player nonetheless. Outside of that, I think you're probably preying on Caleb Wing turning into something. Josiah Hartshorn, who came out of Orange Lutheran, which is, switch hitter, outfielder with some upside. Orange Lutheran, one of the top schools in the CIF, which is probably the top high school baseball conference in the country, just in terms of talent. I think Pierce Coppola is still interesting. It's probably a reliever. but it's a lefty with good stuff who's tall, that's had a ton of injuries, that if you can kind of figure something out there might be some upside. That's kind of an interesting pick. But outside of that, I mean, they're not doing the sort of things that we'll say the Brewers do. We had an article up on this. They're not finding those like high upside, under-scouted, under-committed high school players where you can, get some really big wins in rounds 11 to 20. You're not seeing that sort of approach to the bonus pool. And I think, maybe that's kind of limiting. But we'll see if they change their approach in that sense. I think teams are starting to smarten up to that. So some of it I do think is just the approach in the draft. And, I don't know, the first 5 rounds, there's always some interesting names. After that, they're a little bit more boring than some other teams who might take some bigger shots later or, pull some bonus money down. But I think some of it is just, scouting under-scouted areas. When you have a smaller scouting department, area guys covering more territory, you're probably going to maybe miss on some of those values.
I feel like the last time we talked to you, Geoff, was probably leading into the trade deadline, and Kade Horton was sort of turning a corner. As someone who's tracked him for a long time, what was your take on his development this year? Because for all the issues the Cubs did have this year, they were a playoff team with like Pete Crow Armstrong getting MVP consideration, Kade Horton putting his name, at least in the second half, sort of Cy Young conversation. What's your outlook on Kade now, and what sort of popped in your mind?
Yeah, I think, you look at Horton's season, command continued to tick up, which, was even an issue at points in time in 2024. Granted, some of those AAA numbers might be a mirage because he was pitching in AAA when they were still testing out the ABS system, not the challenge system. ABS was awful. The zones were super inconsistent. They were really, really small. It was a smaller strike zone than pitchers were seeing in the major leagues. Some ways that might have helped them. I think seeing that big development in terms of the command, finding multiple ways to generate outs, whether it's ground balls or weak contact, beyond just, trying to blow it by guys and get swinging strikes. I think, the addition of the sinker, though he didn't throw it a ton, I think it just got guys a little bit more off that four-seam fastball shape. It's kind of a cut ride shape without a ton of ride. The slider is still good, but I think the variation, within the pitch mix, the fact that he was less of a 3-pitch pitcher and really a 5-pitch guy, I think, really allowed him to have success. I think the positive, the silver lining to kind of take in all this, if you're a Cubs fan, is guys usually get better after their first year, particularly on the pitching side. Hitters might slide back a little bit as the book gets out there. Pitchers usually progress and get a little bit better. They get more comfortable. That first initial ascent and taste of the majors usually beats pitchers up a little bit. He didn't get beat up that bad. And I think that there are probably some ways for this to go where he's getting more strikeouts and he takes another step forward over the next couple of years. So he was a really promising development. And I think, one of the few pieces in that rotation that you feel really good about going into 2026.
Yeah, I think we're both Kade Horton fans. Just talking to him, that you can see the intangibles are what you need to succeed in the big leagues, especially as a pitcher. 2 names I'm curious about. One, obviously a top prospect. Jefferson Rojas made it all the way to AAA, but struggled in AAA. Should there be? I mean, he's young. Is that a concern? The struggles, the results. I'm not looking at data. I don't have any all that information. I don't know how much of that is randomness and how much of that is, maybe he was just overwhelmed in AAA. Other guy who put up numbers, no clue if he's actually any good, is Owen Ayers, who had a good AFL. Both those guys, curious your thoughts on where they stand right now, prospect wise.
Yeah, I think with Rojas, he's been so young at every level he's been at. And for the most part, he's continuing to produce, struggled at AA, over the second half of the season. I think some of that was bad at ball luck, frankly. But he's also, I mean, super young. I mean, he turned, 20 years old at the end of April. So entered the season as a 19-year-old. So he's far ahead of where he should be. It was a really good year, though, for him in the Midwest League, where he's still really young for the Midwest League. And I think we know, as folks that have lived in the the northern part of the country, the early months in the Midwest League are cold, man, and it's really hard to hit in cold weather. Once it warms up a little bit in May, things start to get going. He was pretty consistent there. I don't have a lot of questions regarding Rojas at the plate. There's a lot of contact, good swing decisions. The EVs aren't great, but they're good enough for sort of age-based that you can project him to have 45, 50 sort of power. He runs pretty well, not like a demon on the bases, but a guy that could probably steal 15 to 20 bags for you. I think my bigger question marks with him are in the field. The hands and actions aren't great. The internal clock isn't great. He's athletic, but just makes a lot of bad moves and like extra effort plays, dives, jumps, that sort of thing. The arm is still really good. So I don't think he's going to play shortstop. There's still a chance that he's a pretty good third baseman or second baseman. I think he kind of fits more into a utility type of role where it's a guy that can hit, he can run, he can do a bunch of things for you situationally, he can hit lefties. But the big question mark is, where is his everyday position? Some of that stuff might get worked out, but just watching the tape, and I watched pretty much every defensive play that he made throughout the 2025 season. And those were the question marks I came away with. I was a little less impressed than I had been in previous years regarding the glove and the defense. The arm is still there. It's not like he's a 30 defender, but it's more like a 45, and you kind of hope that he gets to a 50 at second base or third base. So an interesting player. I'm kind of on the fence as to where this goes. I think it's probably more like an average regular than a potential above average middle infielder, which is what we thought a couple years ago when, he first, made his stateside debut here and was pretty good. Sorry, who was the other player that you mentioned?
Owen Ayers.
Owen Ayers.
Yes.
I mean, he was kind of on the cusp of the top 30 entering AFL. I try not to take too much away from the Arizona Fall League. So a little bit less on the offense, a little bit less on the bat. I think what people were really buying into, talking to scouts from outside the organization that were maybe getting a first look on Ayers, was the catching defense is pretty good. This is an organization that needs some good defensive catchers. There's a few, but he's probably the one that has the best balance of defense and offense. So I think he's, probably a player that's going to rank somewhere in that 18 to 30 range on the top 30. And I think is definitely a player that's put himself into position to either be in trade conversations or, at least, in consideration for the Cubs in terms of a long-term backup catching option or something like that. He's an interesting player. I think it was, a nice breakout season for Ayers.
Hey, Geoff, last thing, we love these lists. Cubs fans love these lists. The rankings always draw people's attention. Just for our listeners, what else are you working on? What can Cubs fans check out the rest of this offseason in terms of your coverage at Baseball America?
Yeah, so we're still rolling out all the top 10s. We're finishing up the National League this week. Then we're rolling into the American League over the next 3 weeks. We turn in the handbook the Friday before Christmas. We take off a couple of weeks. And then once the new year starts, we start to roll out all the top 30s, the new top 100 list. But in the short term, we're all focused on 40-man deadline day, which is today. And then we'll start rolling out some of our Rule 5 previews, which is for the real prospect sickos. The tickets to the sickos are into the Rule 5. So that's something that me and JJ spend a lot of time on. We love doing it because there's nothing better than trying to discover the 26th man on a really bad team's roster.
I mean, some of those guys turn into a star every once in a while, right? So it's always fun to be on it. Thanks so much for your time. That's Geoff Pontes with Baseball America. Make sure to check out the Cubs Top 10. You can go read his chat with fans, all that good stuff. I'm sure he's working on plenty more lists. Thanks so much for your time, Geoff. This is Northside Territory. Make sure to rate, review, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Check out Baseball America. Subscribe to The Athletic, where Patrick and I are on top of all things Cubs. Thanks for listening, everyone.